Welcome to the first edition of the Prehistoric Project. I'm your host, Fred Sorowick. The purpose of the Prehistoric Project is to introduce people to the vast and fascinating subject of the history of our planet. Just as an individual human has a history, or a nation or civilization, so does an entire planet. While a human history is counted out in decades, and a nation's or civilization's in centuries to millennia, a planet and the life it harbors spans almost unimaginably longer gulfs of time. Recorded human history stretches back only about 5,000 years, while the history of our world reaches back billions of years. If we were to represent all of human history as the thickness of a postage stamp and placed it on the tip of the Washington Monument in D.C., the towering stony bulk of the monument would, in relation to the stamp, represent all of prehistory. Over the coming weeks and months, various episodes of this show will attempt to illustrate and explain the tremendous cast of characters that came and went before us. A good way, in the beginning, to start covering this huge subject is, I think, by the art that has been produced attempting to illustrate and explain prehistory, merging art and science. Over the last century or so, a number of artists have devoted their careers to this challenge. Foremost among them, without any doubt, would be the American artist Charles Robert Knight. Charles R. Knight, as he usually signed his work, was born in Brooklyn. Here's a self-portrait he did early in his life in black and white. He was born in 1874 in Brooklyn to a British father and an American mother who hailed from Maine. From an early age, he suffered from astigmatism, hereditary in his family, and at the age of 6 lost much of his eyesight in his right eye to a thrown rock. For the rest of his life, he was legally blind and wore corrective glasses, especially designed for him. Nevertheless, he was attracted to art very early on, and from the age of 5 used to make freehand copies of nature illustrations from his father's books. As a youth, he was accepted into the formal art training program at the Froebel Academy in New York. He then continued on at Brooklyn Collegiate and at the Polytechnic Institute. At the age of 12, Charles attended classes at the art school of the Metropolitan Museum of Art in Midtown Manhattan. At the age of 16, he was offered work creating designs for a stained glass factory and left home for his first paid job as an artist. After working for the glass factory, he found work in New York City as an illustrator of children's books. This is a title page from one of his books, Birds of the World for Young People, which he became the primary illustrator. Here's an example of one of his wildlife illustrations for the children's book. In addition, he did work for some major magazines, such as McClure's and another magazine called Century. McClure's magazine was a very popular magazine from the late 1800s to about 1930 when it stopped publication. A lot of famous luminaries in the literary world worked for McClure's. Among them, and he met personally, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and Sir Rudyard Kipling. This is Sir Rudyard Kipling, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, the inventor of Sherlock Holmes' character. During this period of the closing years of the 19th century, he began to follow what would be a lifelong passion for depicting animal life by daily sketching trips to the Central Park Zoo. By doing so, Charles began to acquire a growing knowledge of living animals in action. To augment this knowledge with a deeper understanding of animal anatomy, Charles began to regularly visit the taxidermy department of the American Museum of Natural History. In this way, two things favorable to his future lifelong career began to unfold. He gained a profound understanding of the anatomy of animals, from their skeletons and musculature to their outer appearance. And he began to be noticed for his abilities by staff members of the American Museum of Natural History. His animal drawing abilities soon came to the notice of a paleontologist. Dr. Jacob Wortman. Paleontologists like Wortman studied evidence of ancient life, mainly through the fossil record, preserved in the crust in the earth, to understand past life forms and environments. Wortman challenged the young knight to reproduce on paper what a large, extinct, pig-like mammal, called at the time Eleutherium, might have looked like while alive. Using the fossil skeleton of the animal, now called Entelodon, and his knowledge of the bodies of living close relatives, Knight produced a drawing which more than satisfied Wortman and started Knight on a career that lasted for over 5 decades. Following the Entelodon drawing, other scientists at the American Museum of Natural History began to work with Knight on other more involved projects, including large color paintings and wall murals. Among the other scientists who took note of Charles was Henry Fairfield Osborn, who soon became the senior vertebrate paleontologist at the American Museum of Natural History. Through the assistance of Wortman and Osborn and others, Knight acquired more and more work at not just the American Museum of Natural History, but in other major museums around the country. Some of his most outstanding work is still displayed at 3 of them: the American Museum of Natural History, the Field Museum in Chicago, and the Los Angeles Natural History Museum. These are a set of paintings he did for the American Museum of Natural History. They are in chronological order as far as evolutionary history is concerned. The first one is an extinct reptile called Dimetrodon, which is not a dinosaur, but a primitive mammal-like reptile called a therapsid. He also did a relative of Triceratops, one of the ceratopsian dinosaurs, and there are many besides Triceratops. And then, of course, the famous Brontosaur, now called Apatosaurus. Duck-billed dinosaurs, which were big herbivores or plant eaters, like the hadrosaurs in this picture. And then finally, the famous saber-toothed tiger, Smilodon, from the Ice Age, who shared the Ice Age world with our ancestors. After beginning at the American Museum of Natural History, he got a very nice contract at the Field Museum of Natural History in Chicago to do a series of panels for their walls and some other pictures, many of which are still on display. Here's an early 20th century Field Museum News publication announcing some of the pictures he was doing for them. These in chronological order, not in production, but in geological orders. A mural that depicts early pre-life Earth, and then early life in the ocean, microscopic life leading to larger life forms. Underwater panoramas of early invertebrates, non-backboned animals. Animals called sea scorpions, which are now extinct, that could be over 6 feet long, properly called eurypterids. Large armored fish. One of the armored fish got to be very large. This one was a big predator, got to be 25 feet long. Then life evolved, got on the land, plant life took hold, and the early forest appeared of non-flowering plants like giant ferns. Following plant life invading dry land were primitive amphibians like this one. Eventually amphibians evolved into reptiles, like these sailback reptiles that were carnivorous, and other types. This is a scene he did replicating the Solnhofen deposit from Bavaria in Germany, where the first known bird, Archaeopteryx, was found, which dominates the center of this picture. It was a tropical lagoon that when they died, they fell into the soft sediments and got beautifully preserved right down to the feathers. And of course, the famous Stegosaurus. While he was doing paintings for the various museums, the first dinosaur eggs were discovered in Mongolia in the Gobi Desert of Protoceratops, and that's what this painting represents. Protoceratops mothers guarding their egg clutches. Other dinosaurs like Ankylosaurus, the armored dinosaur in the center, and more duckbills. And then, of course, the famous Brontosaurus. Notice the crocodilians off to the left. Back in the age of dinosaurs, what we call the Mesozoic, crocodilians had evolved. Modern crocodilians include alligators, crocodiles, caimans, and gharials, but they had even bigger ancestors long ago. Reptiles took back to the ocean secondarily, and we had plesiosaurs, these long-necked fish-eating reptiles, and then an animal analogous to our modern dolphin, but a reptile instead, called the ichthyosaur, jumping, chasing fish to the right. We also had soaring and flying reptiles called pterosaurs, very large turtles, like the one on the right, probably the biggest members of the turtle family ever to live, and huge ancestral lizard-like reptiles that took back to the ocean that were carnivores, like the mosasaur in the center. On land, he did a mural that depicted an iconic image that caught the attention of the public and still holds it. The classic confrontation between Triceratops and the meat-eater Tyrannosaurus rex. This picture inspired a number of movie producers and directors to simulate this confrontation in movies like King Kong, early King Kong, right up to Jurassic Park and its successors today. After the age of dinosaurs, we have the present Cenozoic, the age of mammals, and the first horses known, the size of a fox terrier to the left, Eohippus, watched on by the first really large mammal to evolve after the dinosaurs disappeared, the Uintatherium, named after the Uinta Mountains in Wyoming where they were first found. Even though they have tusks and look formidable, they're just plant eaters like the horses. As the millennia rolled on, a strange cast of characters of mammals came and went, including these big Brontotheria, but much like a rhinoceros, but with like a slingshot horn arrangement on the nose. And back to the Entelodon that he started with back at the American Museum of Natural History. As we get closer to the present, we have early Ice Age mammals, like the giant ground sloth on the left and the armored Glyptodon, very much like a large armadillo in the foreground. The giant ground sloths are related to the present arboreal, tree-dwelling tropical ground sloths, but they got to be huge, weighed tons, and were totally restricted to the ground because they're too heavy to climb. A fascinating picture he did, which was also replicated in LA later on, was his depiction of the La Brea tar pits on Wilshire Boulevard today in Los Angeles. It's a natural asphalt seep which trapped thousands of animals over the millennia. It attracted herbivores to come drink because a pool of water would form over the asphalt. They would become trapped, and then countless predators and carrion eaters like these giant condors would land, all being trapped subsequently, one after the other. Getting closer to the present, we have mastodons and mammoths. Here's his sketch for mammoths. It's always fascinating to see how he sketched out a painting that he did later on, like this big mural. He actually did 26 big murals. It took him about 4 years for the Chicago Field Museum. And then an animal that almost existed into historic time, the largest member of the deer family that ever lived, now extinct Irish elk, or Megaloceros. Cave bears that our ancestors in Europe knew very well. While he was in Chicago, he also visited the zoo like he did in New York at the Central Park Zoo. And while he was there, he had the opportunity to draw the very first Chinese giant panda that was ever found in an American zoo. And these are his sketches and drawings of the giant panda, a female. After his work in Chicago, he got a good contract to do a series of pictures for the LA County Natural History Museum. Here's a modern picture of the LA County Natural History Museum from the air. Here's an old entrance that he probably knew in the early 20th century that still exists in a late Victorian style. He did a series of paintings there, another Dimetrodon, Brontosaurus, the first known bird, Archaeopteryx, again. Pteranodon, a giant soaring flying reptile that could have a 25-foot wingspan. And then a very interesting animal called Lalops. Lalops is a large carnivore or relative of animals like the T-Rex. They were bipeds, they walked on two legs, they had atrophied small forelimbs, and they were formidable predators. In fact, long before many scientists decided that dinosaurs were warm-blooded for the most part and were very active, dynamic animals, he showed in his paintings that he believed that they probably were, at least some of them were. It shows them wrestling and jousting with each other, two large Lalops. In fact, this painting is replicated in the only movie segment that has Charles R. Knight as the subject, which is a movie made in 1998, a short called Back to the Cretaceous. In Back to the Cretaceous, there is a segment that shows a woman going back in time briefly and meeting Charles R. Knight at his easel in a prehistoric forest or jungle scene. It starts out with the Lalops in a very similar pose.
Excuse me?
Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were...
A little more burnt umber. Yeah.
Oh my God. You're Charles Knight.
Do I know you?
No. No, but I really admire your work.
Oh, thank you. It took me years perfecting my technique.
Your Stegosaurus was really accurate. But your T-Rex was a bit off. They didn't have 3 fingers, it's 2.
Bond and Brown. The skeletons he brought back from the Red Deer River weren't complete. So, we took a guess.
Not exactly good science. Can I ask you something? When you called Archaeopteryx, the bird reptile, a little dinosaur, how did you know? I mean, weren't you afraid of being wrong?
Sibylla bone structure. Seemed a safe conclusion, but you can't be afraid to make a mistake.
Your paintings seem so real. And it's like you actually knew what dinosaurs looked like.
Well, you study anatomy, examine skeletons, watch animals, and then, with a bit of imagination, you put yourself back in time. You seem to have that ability.
Do you really think so, Mr. Knight?
It's remarkable that he did this painting over 70 years before the majority of paleontologists believed that at least some of the dinosaurs were endothermic, like mammals, warm-blooded animals, and capable of a lot of dynamic movement. Besides his many paintings, Charles R. Knight was also a sculptor of both prehistoric animals and modern living animals. Here he is making a stegosaurus. Other animals he sculpted were the famous Triceratops, some of which became bronze sculptures. An extinct mammal that we see in some of the murals for the Chicago Museum, the Brontotherium or Brontops. Here's a close-up of the head with the strange nose horns. Mastodons. And the woolly mammoth. Sometimes he would do a sculpture in the round to make him give himself insight into the best way to show the anatomy of an animal just for a painting or a drawing. Sometimes he did it the other way. Sometimes he would do a sketch in great detail for a sculpture. Not all mammoths were, by the way, woolly mammoths. Only the ones that lived up in Arctic conditions were woolly. Many of the more southern ones probably didn't have long hair at all, like this Columbian mammoth. And of course, the Smilodon, the saber-toothed tiger. As I said, besides the prehistoric animals, he also did living animal sculptures of the present, such as this gorilla, this African gorilla. Here's a sketch he did for a tiger sculpture. And you see how closely it resembles the eventual sculpture in bronze. If you want to see one of his large bronzes, you can travel to Princeton, New Jersey. Right across from the main campus on the main street downtown is one he did in 1944. It's of monumental size, which means larger than life size. It commemorates a benefactor of Princeton University. By the way, the logo of Princeton is the Princeton Tigers. So it's appropriate that the bronze tiger is right across the street from Princeton University. So he finished this in 1944. In fact, he was very fascinated by tigers in general and did many, many paintings, drawings, and sculptures of them over his career. I think because he thought they were beautiful and dynamic and dramatic. This is a sketch he did for his most famous and possibly most beautiful modern animal painting of a Bengal tiger that just captured a peacock, both native to the Indian subcontinent. The colors are vivid, the anatomy is perfect for both animals, and there's a great sense of drama that pulls you into the painting. Besides his many prehistoric animals and modern animals, he was fascinated to do prehistoric humans, among them the Neanderthal. He did a number of Neanderthal portraits, panoramas, and tribal arrangements, like these Neanderthals emerging from their cave, seeing large, possibly prey animals to be hunted crossing the river down below. This is one he invested with a lot of drama. Prehistoric hunter comes home from a hunt and finds his mate killed by a cave lion, which were common in Europe at one time. Another very dramatic one is a prehistoric hunter asleep with his mate at the cave mouth being stalked by a leopard. Another one full of drama is prehistoric hunter being gored and thrown by a woolly rhino. Woolly rhinos were common in the Arctic or subarctic areas of Europe and Asia. Tens of thousands of years ago, there were two species, one with two horns, one with one horn. They became extinct with many of the other large mammals at the end of the Ice Age. Here's another dramatic Neanderthal painting of a Neanderthal group trying to survive a blizzard. Besides Neanderthals, he did a number of pictures of anatomically modern humans, especially Cro-Magnons that lived tens of thousands of years ago in Europe. Here he used an old man in New York as a model for an elder Cro-Magnon man as a sketch. He was fascinated by the fact that Cro-Magnons were animal artists. In fact, he visited cave painting sites in Spain and France on at least one occasion and was given private tours of places like Altamira, where there are famous cave paintings dating back tens of thousands of years into the Ice Age. He felt an affinity with these artists because they both did similar subjects, animals. In 1947, he did a remarkable book called Animal Drawing, Anatomy and Action for Artists, which explains a lot of his philosophy of animal art, how to capture the essence and the personality of animals on paper. And a series of drawings that depict various animals from a skeleton to a complete animal. Here's the tiger skeleton with the musculature attached over the skeleton, all anatomically described, then with the skin, and then finally with the fur, complete animal. And he did that with several other animals in the book. As he aged, he became world famous among natural historians, various scientists, and a certain segment of the art community that dealt with wildlife art. He gained many friends. Among them was a scientist named Charles Frederick Kunz. Charles Frederick Kunz was a self-taught person, never went to college, yet by his early 20s had become internationally famous geologist and gemologist, a vice president at Tiffany's in New York, a consultant to other jewelry companies, and the discoverer of various minerals, an author of hundreds of scientific papers, many books, and received 3 honorary PhDs from various universities, 2 in the United States, 1 in Germany. A mineral is today named after him, kunzite, which is a rare mineral that has gem properties. Here are some of the original specimens of kunzite that he probably examined, and it's probably his writing. He was also a collector of archaeological objects, such as this ancient Olmec jade from Central America. Dr. Charles Frederick Kunz felt that a museum should be built just for Charles R. Knight's artwork. And he arranged to buy the property, select an architect, and go forward with the whole project to keep all of Charles R. Knight's art in one place. However, he died before this ever found fruition, unfortunately, by at least 10 years previous to Charles R. Knight himself. Here's Charles R. Knight in his old age, still painting. He painted right up to the last few months of his life. This is his very last painting he did in early 1953 of a jaguar walking through a forest. Even though his eyesight meager as it was failing. In April of 1953, Charles R. Knight died in a hospital in New York City, and to her relatives, his last words were, "Make sure you look after my drawings, that nothing happens to my drawings." He worried that his legacy would be lost of his decades of work. However, many people are very aware of his legacy. Many books, especially in the last 20 years, have been published about his artwork, such as this one about the artist who saw through time, dinosaurs, mammoths, and cavemen. A reprint of a book he did earlier in his life, Life Through the Ages. And a number of his sketches have been published by one of his admirers, such as William Stout, another new generation of paleo artist. There's a series of sketchbooks devoted to his art, at least 3 that I know of, still in print. A world-famous Harvard biologist, Stephen Jay Gould, used as a cover artwork one of his paintings of a prehistoric sea bottom scene. And he's been mentioned in many other books. During his lifetime, he attempted an autobiography, which was never published. It amounted to 60,000 words. He finally gave up. After his death, his admirers got together and in 2005 published his autobiography posthumously, reducing down the 60,000 words to 20,000 words. Today, his legacy isn't lost and will probably survive for centuries to come, both concerning his prehistoric life forms that he depicted and his modern life forms. Thank you for joining us on this episode of the Prehistoric Project. I'm your host, Fred Sorowick. I hope you'll tune in again and see some future episodes.